where the man who once did the digging and the burying of the proverbial dead bodies in Trump world is about to start drawing a roadmap of his own misdeeds on behalf of Donald Trump. Michael Cohen, the president's former lawyer and fixer, will be on Capitol Hill tomorrow in advance of public testimony expected to cover explosive territory. Cohen is the one who implicated Donald Trump in an illegal hush money scheme that resulted in New York prosecutors giving Trump a nickname of his own, Individual One. Individual One will be the topic of much of Cohen's closed and open testimony this week. Lawmakers say they plan to grill Cohen on a host of Trump-related subjects, including Trump's business practices, Trump Foundation, Trump's compliance with tax laws, hush money payments to women, the truthfulness of Trump's public statements, and questions of whether Trump attempted to intimidate Cohen as a witness. The New York Times on another new Michael Cohen development sure to rattle the president as he heads to a high-stakes nuclear summit the White House hopes will distract from Cohen's testimony this week. The Times writes, quote, Michael Cohen, President Trump's former lawyer and fixer, met last month with federal prosecutors in Manhattan, offering information about possible irregularities within the president's family business and about a donor to the inaugural committee. That's according to people familiar with the matter. The Times reporting making clear that the investigations out of the Southern District of New York very much ongoing, and that Michael Cohen is continuing to field questions about these lines of inquiry, quelling any hope among the president or his allies that an end to Mueller's work would mean any sort of end to the legal and political peril for the president. And that's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. The New York Times chief White House correspondent Peter Baker. And with us at the table, Jeremy Bash, a former chief of staff at both the CIA and the Pentagon, Betsy Woodruff, Daily Beast political reporter, former Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards, and Matt Miller's back, a former chief spokesman at the Department of Justice. Jeremy Bash, let me start with you. This testimony this week is interesting because Michael Cohen is sort of a rogue's rogue, but it's more interesting because of the way Donald Trump reacts every single time Cohen's in the news, whether it's news that Cohen's offices were raided that he described as an attack on the nation, news that Cohen was cooperating with the federal government, which a normal president would be cheered by because he runs the federal government. He called him a rat. He gave an interview where he bemoaned the existence of rats. And now Cohen heading to Capitol Hill to testify in public.
Well, unlike Paul Manafort, unlike Mike Flynn, unlike others who have pled guilty, no one can argue that Michael Cohen, hey, we hardly knew you. Hey, you don't really know your facts here. He served for many years as the chief consigliere, the chief lawyer, I'll put that in quotes because I'm not sure how much law they were upholding or following, chief business fixer for Donald Trump and the Trump Organization. And so when Michael Cohen talks, it comes with a certain level of authority. And I think Donald Trump fundamentally knows that. If I were the chairman of the committee, I'd basically lean back. I'd say, Mr. Cohen, have you seen any shady business at the Trump Organization? And just let the guy talk.
And, you know, Betsy, the president's own friends have said since Cohen first became a household name for those of us who cover this president, that this was the guy, that it wasn't Mueller that kept Trump up at night. It may now be. But at the time that Cohen's offices were raided, people closest to the president said, this is the guy. This is the guy that did the dirty, embarrassing stuff, the kind of stuff that really gets under the president's skin.
That's right. And it's been clear ever since the genesis of the Mueller investigation that the biggest concern for Trump himself and for the people in his immediate orbit has always been about money. The Trump organization, the Mueller investigation really started getting under their skin when Mueller brought on agents with the IRS's criminal investigations section who were there very much to crunch the numbers and sort of dig on this financial issue. And Michael Cohen, more than perhaps anyone who we know to be in touch with his investigators, perhaps Alan Weisselberg, former top accountant at Trump Organization, would be in there too. But Michael Cohen really has an extraordinary level of visibility into the finances of the Trump Organization. That is what Trump has always treated as sacrosanct. Let's not forget, we still haven't seen his tax returns. Right. This money stuff could not be more important to him. And if Cohen has new information about it, that's potentially where he could cause the most trouble for the president.
Peter Baker, let me read you some of the reporting from from your colleagues over the weekend. Your colleagues report, quote, Mr. Cohen, who worked at the Trump Organization for a decade, spoke with the prosecutors about insurance claims the company had filed over the years. Said the people, who did not elaborate on the nature of the possible irregularities. While it was not clear whether the prosecutors found Mr. Cohen's information credible and whether they intended to pursue it, the meeting suggests that they are interested in broader aspects of the Trump Organization, beyond their investigation into the company's role in the hush money payments made before the 2016 election to women claiming to have had affairs with Mr. Trump. Peter, there's this sort of notion out there that what the Southern District of New York did was investigate the hush money scheme, and they basically named Donald Trump. And your byline is on a great story that came out the weekend after the Cohen sentencing memo told us the most information we had, that basically the Southern District of New York, the federal government, sponsored the Cohen testimony. Either they corroborated it or they accepted it, and named the president as an unindicted co-conspirator. This reporting from your colleagues over the weekend suggests that the hush money scheme is just one bucket, to borrow one of the ways we look at the Cohen or the Mueller investigation, that there are other buckets, the inaugural committee, perhaps tax fraud. People, lawyers talk about a RICO prosecution. What does this reporting tell us about what the Southern District of New York is still pursuing?
Well, of course, as you just read, we don't know for a fact exactly how the prosecutors reacted to this information or how intensely they're interested in it. But the fact is that there are so many different strands right now that investigators are pulling on, whether it be, as you point out, the inaugural issue, the business, the foundation, which has now been shut down as a result of a settlement with the New York State authorities, long before you even get to the issues of Robert Mueller's collusion and obstruction of justice probes. And you don't know which one of these things might or might not be the thing, if any, that ultimately creates a genuine problem for the president. But I would say that there's a reason why the president was so eager in not having his private business looked at from the first place. When Maggie Haberman and Mike Schmidt and I went in to see him in July of 2017, we asked him if it would be a red line if Robert Mueller looked into his business other than relationships to Russia, and he said yes, it would. Well, this isn't Robert Mueller, but it is federal investigators, and you can see that this would make him very uncomfortable. We don't know why, but I mean, nobody's very happy having investigators look through their business no matter what. But it does tell you that the issues on the table for this president are wide-ranging.
Matt Miller, Peter's colleagues also reported last week in the big story about obstruction. That story led with an anecdote that really reveals just how troubled the president is about the Southern District of New York. He wanted Matt Whitaker to see about having someone else oversee those investigations, not the career prosecutors. What do you make of this line of questioning that we learned about in the Times reporting over the weekend?
I make of it that Michael Cohen, the reason why the president is so worried about Michael Cohen is not just how long he worked for him, as Jeremy pointed out, but that he really was involved in every aspect of his life. He was involved in the business. He was involved in the campaign. He was involved in the transition and the inaugural, which of course are
he was in the bedroom, if you will.
That's right. He was in the White House talking about his testimony before he went up and gave a full statement to Congress. So he has exposure to to all of the investigations that are the Trump Organization, the Trump campaign, the Trump White House are all now exposed to. And he doesn't just put the president in jeopardy, but he puts the president's family members into jeopardy. I think one of the big questions we'll probably hear asked, I don't know if he'll answer it, he may decline to, is who is executive to? Who is the Trump Organization executive that approved the illegal payment? We know it wasn't the president. It was after the president had left. It's thought to be either his son Donald Jr. or his son Eric Trump. So Michael Cohen is the key that unlocks all kinds of doors into the Trump world. And I think that's why you see the president react so angrily every time he comes into public view.
So, and this is from Michael Cohen's guilty plea. He said, I made these misstatements because I think what we can expect all week long on another network is accusations that he's a liar. And he was convicted of lying to Congress. But at this point, the only thing that shortens his prison sentence is telling the truth. But this is what he said about those lies. I made these misstatements to be consistent with Trump's political messaging and out of loyalty to the president. So people are going to see this week a man who has already confessed to the lies he told and offered an explanation that he did so on behalf of the president out of, in his words, misguided loyalty to the president. But to Jeremy's point, he's also packing all sorts of evidence that will, I don't know how it plays in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion, which really at this point seems to be what drives this president, we heard from Michael Cohen's recordings, the president in his own words, sort of masterminding the hush money scheme and bringing in the National Enquirer, which now has all manner of trouble. What do you think this week will sort of mean for the public watching this whole thing going, what am I looking at?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on how Michael Cohen comports himself. I think it's actually going to be really important, given that we know he's a liar, that the public draws from that. Yes, he lied, but now it turns out that he's really telling the truth. And I think that his demeanor is going to play really heavily into the way the public evaluates his testimony. I also think that for the president, Michael Cohen knows where all the bodies are buried because he buried them. And he's going to be able to testify from firsthand experience with the president about how he was directed, about the times that the president directed him or not. And some of that may go to some of these underlying investigations, but it's going to show the involvement that the president has had in every single detail of his business and his campaign. And I think that's going to be damning for the president and for Congress. I've always thought that members of Congress should not say we're going to wait for the Mueller report before we decide to proceed on in other areas, whether it's impeachment or other investigation, because it may turn out that these details that Michael Cohen is providing actually provide a basis by which one might say that this president is unfit and unqualified to be in the White House.
It's a great point, and Peter's colleagues and you and everyone covering this has always reported that the Giuliani strategy has always hinged on one thing: volume. That they need to do a volume business of crisis, of cover-up, of characters. This will be one man and one story that as I said, Peter Baker wrote as clearly as anybody the weekend after the Cohen sentencing memo came out. Basically, the Southern District of New York sponsored the information that Donald Trump ran a cover-up scheme that impacted the election. They got a pretty clear allegation of campaign finance violations.
And while I think that's significant, I think for the credibility of Michael Cohen, but also for the country's sake, that the focus isn't necessarily on women and hush money payments, because while that may have been violations of campaign finance laws, and that's a very serious matter, I actually think the much more serious issue is that Michael Cohen knows and understands exactly the way the Trump Organization accessed cash. And by that, I mean he had to oversee signing of bank documents, signing of financial documents, that would allow the Trump Organization to borrow money. And if you think about the Russia story writ large, it's really about the Trump Organization's desperate need for cash and the fact that they had to go to the Russian Federation for cash. And so while he won't be able possibly to talk about the Russian angle during this week's public testimony, I think that aspect sets the template for the broader national interest question at heart.
One other really important question for Michael Cohen that I imagine members of Congress will ask is how much documentation he has to back up the claims that he makes. We know he secretly recorded phone conversations with people, including Donald Trump. Any lawyer knows that it's important to have documents and communications to substantiate claims that you're making. And it sounds like it's possible Michael Cohen was a little bit of a pack rat. If that's true, then that could be potentially pivotal.
Peter Baker, if you could jump in here and sort of pull the thread forward. I mean, you cover this White House, you cover this president. He could be anywhere in the world. He could be, I mean, when he made that comment about the Cohen raids being an attack on the nation, I believe he was sitting shoulder to shoulder with his entire national security cabinet talking about if it wasn't North Korea, it was something equally dire. He will be at nothing less than a nuclear summit this week. You get the sense through your reporting that his eyes and ears will be back on events here in Washington?
Oh, I think you can count on that. Of course, he's not going to suddenly give up his phone and Twitter account, even though he's overseas. But, you know, the time difference might make it a little bit hard to respond in real time. It's 12 hours difference. He will have spent all day on Wednesday either getting ready for or having this meeting with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. They have, as you say, it's about nuclear disarmament. Hardly a more serious topic can be thought of. But he will, no doubt, I think, turn on the television at 10 o'clock at night, his time, when Michael Cohen takes a seat at the House committee. And I think that he has made very clear that he thinks Michael Cohen is, as you pointed, a rat, that he is questioned his credibility. He has pointed out that Michael Cohen has been convicted of lying. He's suggested that Michael Cohen's father-in-law should be investigated. Some people have talked about whether or not that constitutes witness tampering or not. No question, Cohen bugs him. That's something that's under his skin. Somebody who had been close to him for so long, who may or may not know about all sorts of things. We don't know yet. We're going to hopefully find out more. It's something the president is taking very seriously, and he's very sensitive about.
He's sensitive about it, and he tweets no collusion every day. Here's what Lawrence Tribe tweeted over the weekend. The very fact that Mueller has said Cohen can't talk about the Trump campaign's collusion with Russia when testifying to 3 congressional committees next week means that Mueller's findings will indeed address that collusion. I mean, what about this idea? And we'll talk about this when we get into the Manafort sentencing memo or what we saw of it, that there's still an effort to protect ongoing investigations and evidence.
I think if Professor Tribe is right, I think that is a very important point. It's not clear to me, however, whether he's not allowed to testify about Russia because Mueller has asked him not to, or if Adam Schiff has asked him not to protect his investigation, which of course is ongoing on a separate track. I think just as importantly will be, does the Southern District of New York allow him to answer these very important questions about the hush money payments? So he's going to be asked about those. Is he willing to talk about them publicly? And I think why it's important is to follow up on a point Donna made. The Congress has a separate responsibility from the Department of Justice. We've heard very clearly from the Department of Justice that they can't indict a sitting president. That means that it is the Congress of the United States that polices presidential misbehavior. That means they need to get the answers to these questions from Michael Cohen. And I'm not sure that the time that we're not past the time when they should be sitting around waiting for the Department of Justice to act. There's a lot of information about the president's conduct now. I think it's about time for Congress to start, not just deferring to DOJ anymore. They shouldn't actively interfere with a criminal investigation. Right. They should work with them to make sure they don't. They shouldn't just sit around and wait for DOJ to finish it.
This is so interesting, and I keep bringing up this point, and Peter Baker's reporting at the time, because at the time, a former Republican prosecutor said to me that if the Congress asked for the findings from SDNY around this case, around Cohen's sentencing, they could probably have access to them. And if they wanted to deal, and the president, whatever happens with Mueller, one thing is true. The president is accused of a felony. He is accused of felony campaign finance violations. He is an unindicted co-conspirator in a conspiracy to defraud the voters. I think the headline on Peter's story that weekend was Trump accused of defrauding the electorate or the voters. Why don't they look at that discrete issue and sort of, one foot in front of the other?
Well, I hope very much they do. There's a very important question that Michael Cohen knows the answer to, which is when the president ordered you to execute this hush money scheme, did he know it's illegal? That's the bar for criminality with respect to campaign finance violations. It may be that the Southern District of New York wouldn't want that question answered publicly because it hurts the rest of their investigation. They may be in plea negotiations with the Trump organization or with one of the Trump kids. That doesn't matter with respect to the president and the Congress's responsibility. They need to know whether the president committed a crime or not, because if so, they have the responsibility to consider whether to impeach him and bring him to the Senate for conviction. They may decide not to do that, but they absolutely have the responsibility to ask the question.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.